So we've talked about nuclear weapons, and I think it's important to pair that with a discussion about how the international community has worked to control and limit weapons of mass destruction over the course of the 20th century and on into the 21st. And so first of all, arms control agreements include a lot of different types of things. Sometimes there's numerical restrictions, right, where you're counting up tanks or guns or bombs, or in the case of the naval agreement between World Wars I and II, it was, I think, cubic meters of displaced water, right, that your Navy could have hull sizes of a certain size, and you could have whatever you wanted, but it could only displace so much water. That would be an example where you can just count things up and say, okay, that's what you're allotted and that's what you're allowed, and anything beyond that would be viewed as a treaty violation or an agreement violation. There can be categorical restrictions where you're saying that there's an entire type of tank or gun or bomb that would be banned as unacceptable. Chemical weapons have been banned as tools of war in that way. Crossbows in the Middle Ages were banned because it allowed for a common person to shoot and punch through the armor of a noble, and that was viewed as sort of a violation of the rules of war, and so crossbows were banned under Catholic teaching as a moral precept. Restrictions on development and testing, right? So this is another reason why, or a way that you can control the spread of weapons, is by saying you're not allowed to even research how to develop these things. And so for biological weapons, there's been agreements that say you're not allowed to research how to weaponize the bubonic plague to make it more devastating and more infectious. You're only allowed to do research on small quantities that would be used for developing antidotes or vaccines. Similarly, with nuclear weapons, there's been lots of discussion about how to limit testing, whether you can test under the ocean or in open air testing, or blow nuclear weapons up in space. And those kind of restrictions hopefully can limit and reduce the speed of development and maybe the spread of these kinds of weapons. You could restrict weapons in certain geographic areas, right? And so there are international treaties saying that you're not to put weapons in Antarctica, that Antarctica is sort of a common demilitarized space for all of the planet. Similarly, the moon has been agreed to be a non-militarizable space, and so there are agreements restricting the ability to deploy weapons there. And then there can be restrictions on the transfer of weapons technology, right? That it would be inappropriate to give certain types of weapons to others, that even if you have these things, you're not supposed to contribute to proliferation. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty specifically has a component where it says nuclear armed states should not give weapons to non-nuclear armed states or help them to develop nuclear weapons. And that's something, if you're interested in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there's a lot more information on that on Blackboard that you can take a look at. All arms control agreements have the same basic problem, which is it's all well and good to sit down with potential rivals or potential allies and pencil out an agreement that says we're only going to have this many cubic meters of displaced water, or we're not going to develop these kinds of weapons. But how do you know that a state is actually in compliance? And in fact, when the Soviet Union collapses in the early 1990s, it comes out that they actually had been weaponizing biological agents, even though they had said that they wouldn't do so under the Biological Weapons Convention. And the justification was, well, we just assumed that the United States was cheating as well, and so we felt that we had to. But this is a problem. How do you know that a state is actually complying? And so there's a couple different approaches that you can take, right? One is simply asking for reports. And so oftentimes arms control agreements will have regular reports that are required of states. And so again, with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, states provide reports to the International Atomic Energy Agency detailing what they have in terms of nuclear materials, nuclear technology. And so they would say, well, we have this reactor in this state, and we have a stockpile here, and we have a research facility here. And the physicists and scientists and engineers at the International Atomic Energy Agency would look at that and say, okay, does this seem like a reasonable kind of thing in stockpile and investment in research that would go along with developing civilian uses of nuclear power or medicine or research? Or does this look like something that might be geared more toward developing a covert weapons program? And so just simply putting forward those reports can allow for them to be scrutinized, and you can maybe get a sense of what's possibly going on. And if there are things missing from those reports, right, that we know that you bought a reactor or that you brought in these particular materials, but I don't see the application of that in this report, that might be a clue that something is a little off, a little fishy. You can rely upon on-site inspectors, right, where you send people in and they go to those nuclear facilities and they poke their head around the door and look and see what's happening and talk to people and interview scientists and figure out what's happening on the ground by going and looking. And that can be, again, a helpful way to get a sense of what a state is developing, what they're deploying, how they're structuring things. On-site inspections can work. And in fact, arms control agreements will oftentimes have components to allow for that sort of thing to happen on a regular basis, either when a report suggests that something is off, or as a way to verify a report, or just as something that's routine. Every 6 months somebody comes through and takes a look at stuff. And then finally, there are technical verification methods that you can use to sort of see if states are doing what they say that they're going to do. Many weapons programs are massive in scale. If you want to enrich uranium, it's going to require these centrifuges that separate out the highly enriched uranium, the stuff that's really unstable and likely to be useful in a nuclear bomb, from the more run-of-the-mill uranium. But to spin those centrifuges for months and months and months requires massive volumes of electricity. And so you should be able to see, massive volumes of electricity being shunted to facilities by transmission lines. And that's something that you can potentially pick up with a satellite or with a plane flying over, right? Or even Google Earth. So here is an example of this sort of technical verification. This is a satellite image of a facility, Chasnup 2, in Pakistan. And you can see Chasnup 1 there, which is the sort of little circle-y thing. They're flagging intake, and so the idea here is that water goes in, it goes into that little circle-y thing where a nuclear reaction is happening, and it boils the water, and the water turns a turbine, and then the water cools and gets discharged out on the side there, right? And so you can look and say, okay, that looks like it has the structure of a nuclear facility, with the water going in, the boiler, the water going out, and then you can look and see that right next to it there is a square that looks roughly the same size. There's an area that's set aside there for the intake. You can say, oh, it seems like Pakistan is building a second nuclear facility right next to their first nuclear facility, and that would be an increase in capacity. And you can pick that sort of thing up with satellite imagery. There are some limits to that, so this one is a little bit less conclusive in my mind. It's a possible reprocessing facility, and the elements that have been flagged are large, tall building and stack, which maybe reflects a reprocessing facility, but I could imagine lots of other industrial applications for a large, tall building and a smokestack. I will also point out there's that little black square there. That's something that's been redacted from this satellite image before it was released to the general public. I have no idea what that is. I don't have classification, and I would have no way of knowing who to ask about that. But one possible explanation is that that's actually a U.S. military facility sitting right there next to Pakistan's nuclear facilities as part of an on-site inspection agreement that the United States may have with Pakistan to ensure that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal and nuclear development programs are relatively safe and secure. Again, me speculating, but that wouldn't be an unreasonable thing, because oftentimes with arms control and proliferation, there is that desire for on-site inspection. Okay, so these are images taken from a U-2 spy plane, flies over, takes photos, and then folks spend their time analyzing these and looking at these and trying to figure out what it is that they're seeing. And so they saw tents and vehicles and maybe missile trailers, or maybe just logging trailers. I'm not sure. It's hard to see. But when President Kennedy was shown this one, he commented, well, those look like sausages. And the CIA said, no, Mr. President, those are nuclear missiles provided by the Soviet Union to the government of Cuba. And that set off that Cuban Missile Crisis that we saw briefly a clip of in the movie 13 Days. All right, just again, giving you an example of how this would work, of getting pictures and trying to deduce from what you see in the pictures what might be going on the ground. There are some real limits to technical verification. One of those is that satellites can just only see so much, right? That you can, I'll give you an example. So in the lead up to the Iraq War, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, went to the United Nations Security Council to make the case that Saddam Hussein was hiding a weapons of mass destruction program. And he talked about a facility that the United States had been tracking with satellite technology. And he denounced Iraq for hiding that facility by putting a roof over the facility, right? And so his complaint was that by simply building a roof, no longer could US satellites tell what was happening at that site, what was going on underneath the roof. It had hidden it effectively from a billion-dollar satellite. Facilities can be built underground. Facilities can be disguised in places where you wouldn't expect to see facilities. And so it's really hard to know just with pictures from above what's actually happening. It almost has to be paired with some sort of on-the-ground inspection to be really effective and decisive. It can also be hard to know who's testing a particular weapon. And so there's an example in the early 1990s. Well, let me back up. So in the late 1990s, India detonates a nuclear bomb, testing successfully their nuclear arsenal. And within a matter of months, Pakistan successfully tests their nuclear bomb. And one of the things that had puzzled folks in the nuclear weapons community was how Pakistan had been able to get a successful test organized and set up so quickly, and had been so confident they would have been really willing to risk that their test might not have worked. And the reason is that they had already tested their bomb secretly in 1992. They had just used a Chinese testing facility, which had been detected, right? The United States knew that there was testing going on in China at this facility, but they didn't know that the bomb being tested had been brought in from Pakistan, and that this was Pakistan's successful test of a nuclear weapon. It's really hard to know. And then it's also impossible to prove a negative. So even if you do have effective satellite surveillance, even if you do have on-the-ground inspections, even if you do have incredibly effective reporting requirements, it's really hard to prove that a country is in compliance and not hiding something just really, really effectively. The United States has gone to very great lengths to try to investigate Iran's nuclear program, everything from secretly replacing street signs in the middle of the night with signs with cameras and Geiger counters to maybe test to see if there was nuclear material that was moving out of Tehran, to dropping fake rocks all across the country, blanketing the country with these rocks with listening devices that would maybe be able to detect if there was underground material or underground activity. You can go to massive efforts to try to collect this information, and you can never really be sure that you haven't missed something. And so there's always that limitation. There's always that uncertainty that's going to be inherent in any sort of arms control agreement and an effort to verify.